Last season, we had a ton of coaches get fired mid-season, including Jay Woodcroft, Dean Evanson, Craig Berube, and more. But compared to last year, things have been awfully quiet. But that is about to change. As we get further into this NHL season and more teams have disappointing starts, we're going to start to see a lot of changes. But that begs the question, which coaches around the NHL are on the cold and hot seat? Which coaches would I personally fire if I had the choice? And who do I see as the first coach to get fired this season? Well, make sure you watch till the end as we go into every single coach's situation, and hit that subscribe button if you're new for more hockey content just like this all throughout the year, presented by BetUS. Now, how we're going to do it in today's video is that we're going to go through 3 different tiers of coach vulnerability. First, we're going to go for the cold seat, coaches that I think could be considered, but ultimately I think will end up staying, at least for the time being. The warm seat, where things start to get a little bit more interesting, and ultimately the hot seat, where if these teams continue down their trajectories, I think ultimately will lead to firing. Now we're going to start things out here in the cold tier. Some of these teams might be a little bit disappointing so far or towards the bottom of the standings, but I still think their coaches are safe for now. Coming in as the first coach here in the cold tier, I have Lindy Ruff of the Buffalo Sabres. Sure, the Sabres not have the great start they maybe would have wanted. That's absolutely true. They're a game below 500, 8-9-1 right now. But I think considering they just hired Lindy Ruff and considering how much Kevin Adams especially is looking at the trade market, I think the Sabres are looking at so many other options before they even consider firing Ruff, at least as of right now. According to a lot of people right now, the Sabres are one of the most active teams out there on the trade front, so I think we'll definitely see a trade or some type of move the Sabres make before we see them consider it. And I think even though the trade market is pretty barren out there, I think the Sabres are going to make a deal happen. With the wealth of prospects, of picks that they still have, they're a team that I think could absolutely still use a lot of that capital to improve the roster now, as they should, and I think that will be the #1 priority. Also in the tier of coaches on the cold seat that I don't think will get fired, even though I've seen a lot of talk about it recently, we have from the Montreal Canadiens, Martin St. Louis. Yes, there has been some glaring problems with the team defensively and how they've been structured up to this point. I don't think Martin St. Louis' position should be completely cold. I think there should be a little bit of pressure coming up here, but considering how much I think the Montreal Canadiens still view themselves in this rebuild, maybe they were expecting some improvement, but I don't think it's the end of the world for them if there isn't. And I think considering that, his job is safe for now. But I do think it is a mix of the roster just not quite being there yet. A lot of the prospects like Michael Hage and Ivan Davidov have yet to arrive. Players like David Reinbacher as well have yet to solidify themselves. And I think a lot of this rebuild is still a definite work in progress. Sure, I would agree. I would have liked to see some progress. I would have liked to see them be competitive. But honestly, considering the Eastern Conference and how many other teams have been disappointing this year after trying to take that next step, it's not really a surprise Montreal's also in that boat. Another one that I would say is on the cold seat right now for a somewhat disappointing team is the Utah Hockey Club's Andre Tourigny, who I think is definitely on the cold seat for sure. Now, Utah is a game below 500. They've been in a weird spot with the injuries on their defense, and I think just like Marty St. Louis, there's a lot of excuses you could give. I still think Utah should be taking this next step. It's what I was expecting coming into the season for them, but I know that I was kind of on an island with that opinion that Utah would make it. It was a hot take around the league that even if it were to end up happening. So I think for most people, the expectations were that they were going to be around this range, mediocre, solid, and maybe taking a next step perhaps, but likely being still in that same range that Arizona was last year. And in that case, Utah's still in that position. But personally, I'm a big fan of Tourigny and what he's been able to get out of those younger players, not just for Arizona, but now of Utah. It's been a steady increase in not just their competitiveness, but also how those young players have progressed. And I think even though he's not getting the results as of right now, as they're still kind of in this rebuild, as you would say, I think he's been getting the best results out of those younger players, and maybe next year is the time where they're starting to really expect some results, being their second year in Utah. But I mean, considering it's the first season, you have some of those first season jitters and lack of expectations. Things I think are in a less stressful spot for Utah, especially with how many jersey sales and all the ticket sales and everything there. I think they're in a position where they're fine being okay just for this season. If next year comes though and there's a lack of progression, I could potentially see a move there for maybe a more experienced coach. Now, I have a little bit of a hot take on the last coach inside my cold seat tier, but first I want to talk about today's sponsor, of course, in BetUS, which is the place to make your picks all throughout this NHL season. Whether you want to make your picks on individual games, if you're feeling individual teams and different scores, or you want to go through the different teams to make the playoffs, or even the Stanley Cup odds, BetUS is the place to do it. Just use code YouTube150 when you sign up. and you'll get an 150% sign-up bonus on your first deposit and 125% sign-up bonus on your next two deposits after that, with 24/7 customer service, 24/7 payouts. BetUS is the place to play this NHL season. Now, for my last coach inside the cold seat tier, I have Andrew Brunette of the Nashville Predators, which might have a few eyebrows raised from some of you guys considering just how disappointing this Preds team has been. It's been brutal, man. Right now, they're 31st in the league. If you sort by points percentage, they're also right there, only ahead of the Chicago Blackhawks, considering how much expectations they had coming into the year with a lot of their free agent signings. Yeah, they have been on a bad spot. But I think Brunette has a little bit of a leash, considering how successful he's been for both Florida and Nashville in a head coaching role. I don't think he's the problem necessarily. I think for Nashville, it's just been a mix of a lot of new players coming in and really a lack of chemistry for a team that needed as much chemistry as possible and had a ton of chemistry last season, which was one of the main reasons why they were able to make the playoffs. I think in Brunette's case, he's one of the finest head coaches out there. To me, a top 5 head coach in this league, even with that limited sample size. What he's been able to do for both Florida and Nashville, to me, has been prolific. And kind of like Buffalo, like we talked about earlier, I think Nashville is more so looking at the trade market and how they can improve that roster rather than looking at the coaching style and how that's formed. Even though it hasn't been perfect so far this year, I think that is the right move. I think they could really bolster up that lineup. To me, there are some weaknesses there, and there hasn't been a lot of there hasn't been really that young wave that Nashville really wanted to see out of the depth so far, and that could be something that they could fix through a trade or just adding some more experience into that bottom 6. We'll see what ends up happening, but I think for the Preds, they're a team that could really stand and make some moves here instead of going for the coach, and I think ultimately that's what they're going to end up prioritizing. But now things start to get really interesting because now we're moving on to the warm seat tier. Coaches that I wouldn't be surprised to see fired, especially if things continue to trend the way they are. And next up, starting us out here, I'm going to go to Greg Cronin of the Anaheim Ducks. Now, this is a situation where I'm kind of back and forth on because he's a personal pick, of course, of Pat Verbeek, and I think Cronin very much fits the style that Pat Verbeek wants out of the Anaheim Ducks. The problem is, I think it's a very hard-nosed style that doesn't quite fit a lot of the flashier finesse players that they've drafted consistently over the past few seasons. Really, until Pat Verbeek came in, they were drafting players like Trevor Zegras, who are very style over substance. And I think you can win with those type of players if you put the right lineup together. But the problem is, in Verbeek's case, he was trying to build a roster that had so many different play styles and tried to bring in a lot more of a hard-nosed presence, and especially with Greg Cronin, that was the idea. But things just have not gelled whatsoever. Last year was a bit of an excuse because, of course, Anaheim's still very deep into that rebuilding mode, but I think a lot of people wanted to see Anaheim turn a corner in a big way. Now, I think they are in the win record. I think in terms of the win-losses, it's not too bad with a 7-8-2 record. That is an improvement over what we've seen out of the Ducks before, but in terms of the actual player progression and guys like Zegras and with a lot of those younger forwards, I don't think it's quite been there, and that to me has been the biggest concern. Sure, even if the Ducks were to improve, that would be great, but if you're not getting progression out of so many of the prospects that you try to draft and put so much effort into developing, then what was the point, really? The last thing you want to become right now is a team like Detroit that, yes, has some good young players around, but is mostly filled out by older guys because those prospects haven't been developed or haven't been getting the opportunities. In Cronin's case, I think it's been a weird mismatch where he's been all over the place. I mean, in a player, in the case of Trevor Zegras, for example, it seems like all of his happiness around the game of hockey is just completely gone. And there's been stretches where he's been playing well, but it seems like then he would demote him, and then it would just be weird ice time issues, and it just didn't seem like there was much consistency in the way he was playing his players and the deployment there. And a player like Alex Killorn getting all the opportunity, who's just been inconsistent throughout this entire year, yet some of the younger players aren't getting those type of chances. I don't know. I think in this situation, especially with Pat Verbeek, I doubt that Cronin's going to get fired yet, but I could see a situation down the line where if things get even worse with these younger players and their relationships, that could be the final straw. Another coach I could see being on the warm seat is Luke Richardson. And as we see with Chicago this season, they're even below Nashville right now. They are dead last in the NHL up to this point. And I think for really everybody in the organization, they were expecting better. You can debate if the Chicago Blackhawks actually deserve to be much better considering the lineup they have, players like Joey Anderson on that first line, for example. But I thought with some of their offseason additions and the health of Bedard this year that we'd see Chicago not necessarily be a playoff team or anything, but be competitive for a couple of stretches here and there and make some big improvements in the standings. But like we've seen out of so many other rebuilders, that's not the case, buddy. It's not as easy as it sounds, and it's not just signing free agents and hoping it works. In Chicago's case, you can make the case they're right back at the bottom, right in the same position as they were before. But the reason I think Luke Richardson and his position as coach is a little bit on the warm seat is just because of not just the lack of progression in the team, but also just the miscommunication. There was a situation where Taylor Hall was scratched this last week, and Hall was completely blindsided by it. Richardson would later apologize and say it was a mistake, the lack of communication there, but I think it just shows kind of the ineptitude that Richardson has had as coach for this Blackhawks team. I mean, where's the systems? Where's the improvements? Where is the progression? And you can't even communicate with your players correctly, especially in the case of Taylor Hall, who is an absolute class act and now an NHL veteran. To me, it just doesn't seem like he's fit for this role right now, and I think is just way in over his head. At least so far, the results haven't been there, and I think they ought to be. It is a similar situation, I think, with Marty St. Louis, where because they're still in this rebuilding phase, that even if they take a step back, it's not the end of the world. But as of next year, I think Richardson is really going to start getting a lot of heat towards him. If there's not any progression next season, then I think Richardson is as good as done. On to another Central Division team, but a team that isn't rebuilding, this time in the St. Louis Blues and head coach Drew Bannister, the last one in the warm seat tier. To me, Bannister is a lot different from a lot of the coaches we talked about so far, because the Blues actually had lofty expectations. I mean, they made some big moves in the offseason, of course, with their offer sheets that so far have been paying out. But in the Blues case, they were supposed to be a competitive team, and I think still can be. But Bannister and the systems we've seen so far just really haven't gotten the most out of this team. And that, to me, is the biggest reason why maybe he could even see himself in the hot seat tier. But I mean, considering how new of a coach he is, I mean, just being hired mid-season last year, I think he has a little bit of a longer leash than he maybe would have. But this is a Blues team that I still think can be around the playoff race. Even though I didn't have them as a playoff team, I had them just outside. But they've been a disappointing team, a couple of games below 500. Obviously, it is still early, but I think the Blues were expecting a lot more out of themselves and could be looking towards Bannister to make another change. But now, folks, we are officially moving in to the hot seat tier. 3 coaches are left, and these 3 coaches I see are the most likely to get fired this year. Starting us out, of course, and maybe the least likely to get fired, just because I think of how inept that management is and how much of a leash that this guy has always had with Pittsburgh, and of course is Mike Sullivan. If it were up to me, I think Sullivan would be gone, not because I don't think he's a great coach. I think he's a top 5 coach in this league, but every coach has an expiration date. That is truth. It is just always the course of things in the NHL. Everybody in every situation has an expiration date, and I think in Sullivan's case, he's lost a lot of that team. Granted, I don't think the team is that great in the first place, but I think the Penguins are going to eventually have to fire Sullivan, and I think the time is now before things get even worse. The problem for me is that I don't even see a situation where they don't regret firing Sullivan, because I think he is a premier coach in this league. But the problem is, I think if they keep him, they're going to regret it, because I just think at this point, the communication is just not there. It hasn't been there, and I don't think that this course is going to change with the same voice that has been there for so long. I think the Penguins are in such a bad need of new influences, new coaching styles, new anything on that team, and firing the head coach, bringing in a new one is the easiest answer to that. A 7-10-3 record ain't gonna cut it, but the reason he isn't number 1 on this list is just because of his connection and relationship with the Pittsburgh higher-ups and everything there, and it's a reason why I think Sullivan has gotten a lot of the benefit of the doubt. Even though I think the Pittsburgh roster is the main issue, I think that's gonna be the biggest thing that could maybe cause Sullivan to stay as Penguins head coach, that they just see the roster as the biggest thing and they need to make a lot more changes, which we've already heard a lot about. So we'll see what ends up happening, but I still think Sullivan has a lot of pressure under him right now to get the Penguins out of this hole, and if he doesn't, he could be fired. I still think there's the chance. You know what? I lied, because if I was in charge of all 32 NHL teams and I had the chance to fire one coach that I think the firing could be so pivotal to the team's success, I actually think the most important firing could be Derek Lalonde of the Detroit Red Wings. To me, the answer is clear. Lalonde is not the coach for this team. And granted, I have my issues with that roster. Do not get me wrong. I'm a Steve Eisman guy, but my God, man, really? There's the issue with the roster for sure, but Derek Lalonde has not done anything with it to really produce the most results. I mean, there are so many issues, I think, with Lalonde's style that I think have crept up to this Red Wings team. The boring play style that really has not gotten the best out of all of those younger, more exciting players for a long time, putting Seider with Sherratt, which just tanked Seider's ability to produce and to be the player that he needed to be. Finally, he put Edvinsson with him, and we've seen some great results out of that. But the rest of the roster, when Seider and Edvinsson ain't playing, is a disaster. And even though I have my problems with the roster, I think Lalonde is the easiest thing to go, the easiest thing to make a move on, especially considering Detroit's cap space and lack thereof. And I think ultimately he will be one of the first coaches to get dealt. If I'm Detroit right now, I am running to Jay Woodcroft, even though he might not be the total experience that maybe you'd want in that position. To me, with how much he was able to get out of Edmonton and how much he was able to really get out of that defense, there were still problems there, but I think especially in his best moments, there was some great times there for Edmonton, and I think the Red Wings could really use that type of fresh new blood. We'll see what ends up happening, but I think Lalonde is certainly on the hot seat, and honestly, I think should have been fired already. That loss versus San Jose, that choking that they had, it's just the last straw for me personally. But now we go on to the coach that I think is on the hottest seat in the league right now, the coach that I see as the most likely coach to get fired next, even though Lalonde is right up there and would be second place for me. To me, the coach that is on the hottest seat right now is Jim Montgomery. Now, I guess the Bruins are technically second place in the wild card race, but their season has not been up to snuff. An embarrassing 5-1 loss to Columbus at home. Things are rough right now for the Bruins. Now, if it were up to me, I would personally keep Jim Montgomery because I'm not a big fan of a lot of that Boston roster, especially in the forward group, especially with the depth. I think Sweeney should be in a much hotter position than he probably is right now. But I think ultimately the blame is going to go on Jim Montgomery, and he is one of the best head coaches in the league. To me personally, he's something that I loved in Dallas, loved what he was able to do with Boston. He's going to be almost the carbon copy of the Bruce Cassidy situation, where the Bruins regret firing him and once again hire a new coach under Sweeney that potentially will get fired in a couple seasons time. I don't know. That's just how I see it personally. If I was going to fire somebody on Boston, it wouldn't be Monty. I'm just going to say that. But also of what we learned recently about how the Cassidy firing happened and how a lot of the Bruins top end players went up to the Boston management and talked about Cassidy and how they wanted him to be fired. Maybe some of the accountability needs to come to some of those leadership players, quote unquote, on the Bruins, and not what Montgomery's been doing, because I think he's one of the better head coaches out there, and the Bruins simply put have not been executing for him. Although I wouldn't do it, I think Montgomery is going to be the first coach fired, and the Bruins are going to be making a big change in direction coming here soon. But those are the coaches that I see being on the chopping block. I would love to hear your thoughts down below on the potential firings around the league, which coaches you see in the hot and cold seat, and who you see being fired first this NHL season. But thank you guys so much for tuning in. If you guys did enjoy, of course, make sure you hit that like button, hit that subscribe and hit that notification bell, comment down below all your thoughts, and share with all the hockey fans you guys know online. And of course, click on this card for all my Trade Rumor content right in one playlist. I will see you guys in the next one. Have a fantastic hockey day. And of course, sign up to BetUS today using code YouTube150. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.